film of services. It's like up on Facebook.
Okay, time for us to get together and start our study tonight. Thank you for everybody who's here. We're going to go into chapter 25. And really, I thought about just trying to cover 25, but they kind of go all together. We'll see how we do tonight. I'd like to read through chapter 26 because 26 just has so much in it that just shows us so much about Paul's emphasis, and just it's just amazing when you see what the Spirit is doing in chapter 20. And it's bizarre too, because he's in the midst of people that are just from a different world. Paul might as well be talking to aliens here, as to them being able to understand anything about this. Agrippa is the closest we get, but it's just sort of amazing to note that, to see that. So I want to get into this and start in chapter 5. I'm going to have a note concerning the Gospel of Luke before we get started as well. But before we do that, let's bow for a word of prayer. Mr. John, would you lead us in that prayer?
Most righteous Father, for this day, grant the watching over us, forgive us of our sins. Pray that as we study your word, we will put our minds and thoughts upon your word and not on the world, that we apply our lives to be better Christians. Pray that we grow each day in your word. Pray that we never fall away from you. Be with those who are sick. Grant us all in heaven. We ask in Christ's name.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So we recall with the book of Acts, and today, of course, we're going to be dealing with Paul really before Agrippa. We have Festus in the middle of all this too, but Festus, there's not really much of a conversation there. Festus is arriving there, and he's trying to put all this into order. So we'll talk more about that. But the whole point of the book of Acts, if we remember, is this point of witness and testimony. And the ends of the earth. Really, again, we're back to Jerusalem and in Judea, this particular point. Where is Paul right now in our studies? Caesarea. Now, there were two Caesareas in Israel. Which one are we talking about?
One by the ocean.
The one by the sea. Maritima. So there was a Caesarea Philippi that was farther up north and more to the east, which was famously the place where the god Pan was worshipped. And so, but we want to make that distinction because we find Caesarea Philippi in other places. So that helps us remember that. We're in Caesarea by the sea. And who is the active character that all see throughout the book of Acts? Well, we have Paul, but Paul's not in the whole book. Who is the one? Well, Luke is certainly part of the whole book as well. Driving action. Who's driving the Holy Spirit? Yeah. So you could call this some of the acts of a few of the apostles. And really, you could go so far as to say the acts of the Holy Spirit through a few of the apostles that we can find. And we remember, and we've been reminding ourselves of this all through this book, right? That just because we're centered on one point doesn't mean there's nothing else going on anywhere else. And so we want to set that in mind. As we mentioned as well, though, you do have general main fixtures. Chapters 1 through 2 generally focus on Peter. 13 through 28 generally on Paul. And remember, we've been through Paul on 3 journeys now. He came back to Jerusalem after the 3rd missionary journey, which perhaps was the most arduous of his journeys to some degree, up until the time that we're coming up on, his journey. His journey to Rome is going to possibly be the most challenging part of our final book. And yet Paul is so resolute, he's so faithful, He knows he's going to go. He's going to go. He knows he's going to end up where the Lord. What did in the midst of the trouble in Jerusalem? What did God promise to Paul?
Be a witness of him in Rome.
In Rome, essentially promising him, you're not going to die here in Jerusalem. And what's fascinating about this too, we're going to hit a point tonight where we see that Paul is all for that, and in fact, he is part of engineering this whole trip to Rome. By appealing to Caesar, he has essentially set his tracks up, and he is on his way to Rome because, as we'll kind of see, that Festus, his hands are sort of tied to some degree. Had a few options, but Paul, I think, was resolute. He wasn't going to allow himself to stay in Caesarea or to go back to Jerusalem. So just a few things that we note tonight. We're going to see that Festus is going to learn about Paul. Remind me, how long has Paul been in Caesarea?
2 years.
2 years. And why is that? Why hasn't he seen justice, an uncondemned Roman?
Well, Felix wanted some money.
Mr. Ken? Oh, yeah, same thing. Yeah, Felix is hoping to get some kickback from him. Now, we don't have any evidence that ever happened. And I think, I don't know if this is the same logic of why some people break into church buildings sometimes. Maybe they think there's a safe somewhere. It just doesn't really make much sense. But ultimately, Festus sort of takes over from Felix's position at some point. And we're going to see that Paul appeals to Caesar. Agrippa comes to Caesarea to try to help settle this matter. Agrippa and Bernice gather with other leaders to hear Paul and Paul's defense before Agrippa. And as I said, I'd like for us to read through chapter 26 just as a whole, if we can. So let's look first of all at what we see. Oh, I'm sorry. I mentioned as well. I wanted to make note of on page 92 in our material. I've got right at the bottom the God Luke writing 58 to 60 AD. The reason being that while Paul is in Caesarea, Luke isn't just hanging out in Caesarea, is he?
Oh, no.
It seems that that Luke would have been able to have free reign to travel at this time. And most historians tend to agree that this would have been a very convenient time to amass his sources for his gospel. And what's interesting too, we don't really have a whole lot about how Matthew and Mark assembled their gospels or when that occurred. We know John assembled his later on, likely after Peter died. We say that because Peter is named as the one who cut the servant of the high priest's ear off. But Luke, there's a lot of reasons for us to see this. And again, Luke, if you remember in his gospel, what's he doing? What's he framing that whole gospel as from the start? Well, it's on Jesus. But what do the first few verses of the Gospel of Luke say? Let's go back to Luke 1. And we don't have to read it, but just somebody tell me, what is his main goal in writing this Gospel? Set it all in order? And I think, Ken, you were saying to record
the whole, everything about the things we surely believe.
Yes, yeah. He wants Theophilus, whoever Theophilus is, to have a perfect understanding of the things that they've understood. And so Luke himself was not an apostle per se, but he is an inspired writer. And some people think that he pulled a lot from Peter for his gospel. So it's pretty interesting to think about that. So I want to note too, we mentioned Felix sort of kicking the can down the road. A thought occurred to me. Think about how quickly Paul handled that problem in Acts chapter 6 when the Grecian widows were neglected. How quick did it? How long did it take for the apostles to handle that? Not very long. They said, you appoint these men to set them over this work. And they went ahead and did it, and the work got done. Compare and contrast. No, excuse me. He's a Roman citizen. It's amazing. You see the ineptitude of mankind versus the righteous judgments of God and the quickness. And that's such a good lesson as a local congregation, isn't it? When an issue comes up, we take care of it. As Barney Fife said, nip it in the bud. You get to it quickly, and you get done with it, and you move on. I'm not saying every problem is going to be like that, but there's something there for us to look at here. So Festus said, he wrote in verse 1 of Acts 25, 3 days from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And we note in this passage the high priest and the chief men informed him against Paul. And what are they wanting to do? Plan?
Well, they wanted to get Paul to them to bring Paul back to Jerusalem, but kill him before he gets there.
Yes. So again, and this is filling our blank in for Acts 25:3 on page 93 there. They wanted Festus to bring Paul to Jerusalem, intending to ambush him on the way. So again, we've got another Jewish plot. I'm getting sick of those, frankly. I don't know about you. But here's the thing. It just goes back to their ruthlessness. And I really, I thought Jeremy's point about, the fellows that were going to starve themselves until they killed Paul, saying, I hope they starve themselves, from the standpoint. I may get those words wrong, but they were willing to go that far in opposition of this. So that's a danger. That's actually a very dangerous enemy. Someone who's willing to hurt themselves in order to hurt you. But Festus, as himself, he was procurator from about AD 60 to 62. He doesn't stick around very long. There's more that we could go into there as far as his history, but I don't know how much really that works into helping us understand the plot here, except that Festus seems to be in a way very similar to Felix. I think what we can pull from Festus is he's interested in keeping the Jews satisfied. That's his main priority, which means he's going to do what he can. But at the same time, he wants to watch his own back. And so does he go along with what the Jews are suggesting? No, he doesn't. He says he's going to be in Caesarea. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say that he answers to Rome. They put him there,
Yes.
so we better keep the peace.
Absolutely. And what does he suggest that they do in verse 5? What does Festus suggest the Jews do?
Come up to Caesarea and stand and face to face with Paul.
Yeah.
And bring their charges.
Yeah.
Well, they're a bunch of liars, and they had.
Well, and that's where we end up, right? In verses 6 through 12, we just note again that we have these unproven charges forward here. When he had remained among them more than 10 days, verse 6, he went down to Caesarea. The next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. So here's Festus. He's sitting on the judgment seat, this place of power, essentially. And the Jews had come down from Jerusalem. Let's recall, is Caesarea north or south of Jerusalem?
It's north that you go to just Caesarea and
Yes.
Jerusalem.
Yeah. We're talking about elevation, aren't we?
Yeah.
So we're going to want to remember that. So we're going down to Caesarea, down from the mountain that Jerusalem is on as well. So they go there, and they make many serious charges, which they could not do what? Couldn't prove them. Didn't have any evidence. This is the equivalent, really, of someone saying, oh, well, he said something. He said I don't like. He said something that made me feel bad.
Hurt my feelings.
Yeah. But, yes, sir.
What was it? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And then in verse 8, in his own defense, Paul is saying he had done what?
Nothing against the Jews, nothing against the temple, nothing against Caesar.
Yeah, nothing against the law of the Jews or of the law of Caesar, right? So here's the thing, and this is first of all a pretty good application we need to make here, is that when we haven't done anything wrong, we need to maintain that we haven't done anything wrong. We live in a world where you go to be tried in a place, and what they'll do is they'll try to get you on a big thing. And even if you didn't do that big thing, they try to get you on some kind of plea deal. Listen, they're going to convict you. You're for sure going to, face those things, and there's going to be serious consequences. But if you plead to a lesser charge, well, did you do that lesser charge? If you didn't and you plead to it, you're lying. So Paul is being consistent. He's saying, I've done nothing to deserve this. And he's being clear about that. Again, I want to note, we've made a lot of comparisons between Paul's experience and Jesus' experience, right? But Jesus famously, did he defend himself and say, I've done nothing? I mean, there are times where he says, essentially, I've done nothing worthy of your ire, more or less. But when it comes down to him being before the Sanhedrin, what does he do?
Silent quiet.
Yeah.
Fulfillment of prophecy.
Yes. Yes, and that was a fulfillment of prophecy, that he would go as a lamb to the slaughter, keeping his mouth shut in that. Now, he did say some things to the high priest, didn't he? When he was asked, are you the Messiah? That was when he said, I am. And that's my big moment in those proceedings. But yes, sir.
The high priest said, I adjure thee by the living God. He had to answer.
Yes, yeah. And so from that point, you make a solid point there, because as the high priest, he could command that, and to live by the law, Jesus had to answer something. But you can contrast this to Paul here. Paul doesn't have to pull back in this situation. Now, perhaps if Paul was before the Sanhedrin, if he was before a group that he wasn't going to listen to him, then maybe it would have been more like Jesus. But there's an interesting thing that Paul brings to the table here. He knows that with these Gentiles, with these worldly people, that there's hope. And I say Gentiles. I mean, again, you're talking about the representatives of the Roman Empire in Judea. But he knows that there's going to be more of a possibility to try to reach them than the Jews who are accusing him. And so once we find that, or once he clarifies that he hasn't done wrong, Festus says, well, do you want to be judged in Jerusalem? And of course, Paul doesn't want that. And I like the intensity of what Paul says here. Verse 10, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in the nothings in which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Here's a man who knows his rights, and he's willing to use them. And I think, keep in mind the context, I believe Paul was using his rights for the sake of the gospel, because again, what's the big picture? The Lord said, you're going to go to Rome, and you'll be a witness for me there. That's his mission. Paul isn't trying to defend himself so that he just escapes and just goes to some random place. He's intending to fulfill the Lord's mission for him. So, as we move on in this, Paul essentially, I think it's fascinating too, by the way, that the emperor is Nero at this time, because Nero was famously insane and famously, later on, not quite at this time yet, but later on, he blames the fire in Rome on Christians. So he ends up to be a very, very dangerous man. But we note that Festus essentially says, hey, you've appealed to Caesar you shall go. Now we note that Festus could have done a couple of different things here. What are some other things that he could have done instead of just doing what Paul asked for. Well, he could have just released Paul. He's still an uncondemned Roman. And in fact, there is a point where bringing this matter to Caesar carries with it risk for Festus as well. Because if Paul goes all the way to the emperor, and there's a determination this was not worth the emperor's time, then Festus would be under the knife for that.
The thing that I picked up on when I did a little studying on this was they wanted one of those guys. Felix wanted Festus. Festus was stuck with he's got to write something. Mm-hmm. He's got to put something down on paper to send to Rome. He didn't know what to do, but boy, there comes Agrippa. Maybe Agrippa will do it for him.
Yeah, he's kicking the can down, isn't he? He's hoping that Agrippa takes care of this problem, which, there's a lot of politics wrapped up in this, and we'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, I think it's just important to establish that Festus could have, and I think we could argue should have, just released Paul. But I think Paul knows that is a much riskier option for him. He knows the Jews are lying in wait for him. He knows there's going to be all these ambushes, these difficulties there. It makes a whole lot more sense going to Rome with an escort, doesn't it? So we can understand why Paul pushes for that. So we move on and we look at Agrippa. Agrippa II, Herod Agrippa II. Is this the same Herod that killed the male children when Jesus was little? Is this the same Herod that killed James with the sword?
No, the worms took care of him.
No. So you've got a family of Herods here, and we want to kind of trace that back a little bit. I've got a family tree coming up in just a second. But Agrippa II is fascinating because he wanted reputation that he was one of the Jews. He wanted to make everybody understand, I follow the law just like you do. And what's fascinating about that too, he sought to quell Jewish uprisings, but he eventually threw in with the Romans, ultimately. Now, he survives through the destruction of Jerusalem. Historians say he died about AD 101. So he's going to have a pretty long life, apparently. So Agrippa and Bernice. Now, we want to note who Bernice is, but again, I don't have a whole lot on her. If y'all have more to add there, feel free. But here's the Herod family tree. I couldn't help but think of them. Just the months, just the adders. These are people. I mean, they really are. You look into the histories of who they are and what they did. Bernice had later on. Bernice marries Vespasian, and so she's like married. She was a consort of Vespasian. And she ended up getting with Vespasian, Vespasius. So these are people that just, I think it's important we note, just like Pontius Pilate, they're just completely lacking in a moral compass. They just don't have that mindset. Yes, sir.
I think Brother Walsh said, I think that Bernice was Agrippa's sister, and they had an incestuous relationship.
Yes.
And then there was another man she married to kind of cover that up.
Yeah. And so, and a lot of these things were more or less publicly known from what I've been reading as well. So I want us to note a few things, though, if I can get my mouse over here. Of course, Herod the Great is the one that we kind of look at as he's the guy that made a pretty big wave in Judea. He was able to sort of get on Julius Caesar's good side because of them, and a whole lot of free reign with shaping Judea's future. He arranged for the temple to be built, the temple of Herod, not the temple of Herod, but Herod's temple that he built for the Jews. Thought that he did that almost as an apology for killing all their male children at one point. He was vastly hated for that reason. But the Jews took the temple, hey, nicer than what they could have built. But then there's family from that point. We have Philip, who had a relationship with Herodias, and then you have Herod Agrippa the First. Again, we could talk more about this family. Herod Antipas, as we mentioned earlier on in the book of Acts as well. But then Agrippa the First, and then you have Agrippa the Second. And again, Bernice's sister. Felix is related to this family, again, sort of through Drusilla, as far as married into it. So, again, that's essentially our family tree of the Herodian, I guess you could say, dynasty. But again, all these really are puppet kings of the Romans. They're not really important of themselves. But what we like to do sometimes is we want to act more important than we really are. Maybe we think of ourselves as more important than we really are. I do want to say there were interesting things that you note about this. Here are the pillars in Herod the Great's reef or promontory palace complex. Possibly this is the site of Paul's hearing and trial in Acts 25. You have Herod's aqueduct in Caesarea. So again, the footprints of great. They fall. His shadow falls quite a long time, quite a long while. And so that just sort of helps us sort of get an understanding of Agrippa II. But what's fascinating too is Agrippa is unique in that way, that he wants everybody to think of him as a fellow Jew. And there are some things that Paul says that really get to that point and challenge him on that. So Agrippa II likely had more understanding of the way than Festus. Especially, here's the thing, when Paul was going through all these places and starting churches, and then later going back through them and helping to appoint elders and arrange for that to be done in other places, what was one advantage that they had in appointing those elders in those places? Who was in those areas that would have already known about God? Jews, yeah. So the Jews in the diaspora, in the spreading of the Jews, all over those places in those countries, you had people who were already familiar with the law. And again, we don't want to underestimate that. We want to remember that every Hebrew boy and girl was supposed to recite the law and to be able to know the law. We have a generation that came out of the exile saying, we don't want that again. No more idols for us. A group of Jews that were able to face the Roman dignitaries that came to Judea when they talked about being subsumed by the Roman Empire. They said, well, we're going to have to put up statues of our gods here in Jerusalem and in Israel. And the Jews said, you're not going to do that. He's like, well, we just need to kill you. At that point, the Jews pulled their collars back, essentially inviting them to do so. And the Romans backed off. They let the Jews continue in their worship, which was very unique. So it is, you have this fellow who is interested in making it known that he wants to say, I'm a Jew just like you. So there's actually a lot of hope here that we want to appreciate. I want to ask too, with Festus reaching out to Agrippa, we don't have to cover this too much, but how would you characterize his outreach to Agrippa? How does he kind of portray himself?
He just got left with a bad situation. He's helped.
Yeah.
I kind of get that. He hoped Agrippa would, like you said, solve his problem for him. He kind of he referred to Felix having kept him the 2 years, and he said, I'm really not sure how to handle this. So I don't have anything right. I don't have any charges to bring against him.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting that that he says in verse 17, therefore when they come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat. Again, we're seeing this theme that these people want to present themselves in the most positive light they could to these fellows, whether that's true or not. So it's just sort of fascinating. Then in verse 22, Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Well, tomorrow you shall hear him. Verse 23, the next day when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought in. So a lot of pomp and ceremony here going on. And again, it's sort of read out that here's the issue, and he has done nothing deserving of death, but we want to put him before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, verse 26, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. So Festus is, again, he's taking Agrippa. Agrippa is going to be someone of notoriety to some degree to the emperor, that if he has Agrippa's hand in this, it just bolsters him and helps give him a little bit more protection for sending this fellow to the emperor. Yes, sir.
One thing I picked up that Agrippa didn't have jurisdiction in this area. He wanted to have a hearing, but he had no jurisdiction to find him guilty or whatever. It's strange.
Well, I wonder if I'm not familiar with it. I wonder if Festus, being the one to initiate that, maybe since he had jurisdiction, he could delegate, and maybe there's part of that. I don't know, but I do think that a lot of the reason for him including Agrippa is political. I don't think it's he's not trying necessarily to help Paul. He's just trying to sort of save his skin and make sure that he gets out of this okay, and that no issues with the Jews come up more.
God's quite profound in all of this.
Amen. Absolutely.
That's it. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
God's got control.
And it's just, it's just another lesson where we recognize that God will use wicked people to accomplish his goals. And without them even really knowing they're a part of that. So, our blank down at the bottom of page 93, when he was in Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders had made charges against Paul demanding that he be what? He be punished. Mine would say condemned, but yeah, I think there's a desperation here. And if they're able to make this stick, then if they can get to where Paul is a condemned Roman, then it's all over. If he's condemned of something, then yeah. But they haven't been able to prove anything. So just like what happened with Jesus. On page 94, our fill in the blank there, right before Paul's defense before Agrippa, Festus stated it would be unreasonable to send a prisoner to the emperor without specifying the charges against him. Yeah, very good.
That'd be a waste of Caesar's time if he didn't have anything to want.
I think that's the thought there. So let's go ahead and let's read through chapter 26. I'm going to split it up three ways. Mr. Murphy, if you would, read 1 through 11. Would you like to read some? What's your name? I forgot your name. Destiny. I got problems, y'all.
Wait till you get over.
I'm so sorry, Destiny. Would you read verses 12 through 23? Is that okay? And then Mark, if you would just finish out the chapter.
Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee, touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee, expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews. Wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, which was at the first among mine own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify, that after the most greatest sect of our religion I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers, unto which promise I've instantly serving God day and night, hope to come. For which hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. Why should it be thought a thing incredible with you, that God should raise the dead? I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem. And many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. And when they were put to death, I gave my voice, or my vote again, and I punished them off in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme, being exceedingly mad against them. I persecuted them even unto strange or foreign cities.
In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you to open their eyes, so that they may turn from the darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins, and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and also to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds in keeping with their repentance. For this reason the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. To this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small, saying nothing but what the prophets and what Moses had said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that, by being the first to rise from the dead, we would proclaim life both to our people and to the Gentiles.
As he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. But Paul said, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. The king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly, for I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a foreign. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, In a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul said, Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. The king rose, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar.
There's Agrippa, again, bringing light to the fact that Paul had essentially set his fate at that point by doing that, by appealing to Caesar. So this chapter preaches, and I'm sure we've heard some fantastic sermons on it, because this moment with Agrippa and Paul, we're going to talk about those questions about, like, is he saying I'm almost persuaded, like we sing in the song, or is he saying in such a short time you're going to try to make me a Christian? So I tend to think it's the latter more than the former. We'll talk more about that. But Paul is aware of Agrippa's knowledge. I don't think that he's buttering Agrippa up. Do you? I think he's just simply saying that, as we have in our fill in the blank toward the bottom of page 94, to stand before him, what's his emotion there? He's happy. He's happy. I think myself happy, King Agrippa. Because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things which I am accused of the Jews. Here's somebody whose name has been besmirched, who's been dragged through the mud, and now he'll be able to really lay it all out. And it's kind of fascinating that I think about this, and I think there's real value in allowing someone to make their case, isn't it? We've had for such a long time in this country a media that's sort of dominated by sound bites, 30-second clips. What do you think of this? Okay, in 30 seconds, let me deal with this. Versus now, you have a lot more media out there that's very long form. Like, we're going to talk for 2 hours about this thing, which is, in some ways a blessing. Paul is able to lay out his case. And what's fascinating about this part, we get more in this telling of his story than anywhere else in the book of Acts. Now, again, there are some things that we get from those other tellings that we don't get here. But as the actual amount of words, he's really able to lay it out. And I want to note again, he's not buttering Agrippa up. He says in verse 3, you're an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. He knows what he's talking about. Agrippa can identify those things. Therefore, he says, I beg you to hear me patiently. Really try to listen to these things. And we note in verse 6, by the way, he goes back into his youth and everything. He focuses in verse 5 on how he was brought up a Pharisee, which again would have been familiar to Agrippa. He's dealing with these people. He knows what their aims and their goals are. And in verse 6, what does he say? He says it's because of what that he's on trial. Yes. So let's break that down. I'm judged for the hope of the promise of God to our fathers. What are we talking about there?
It's about the Messiah.
Okay, but not just the Messiah. What has he been saying in the past couple of chapters? The resurrection.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. He brings up the resurrection without really saying the resurrection, right? Because it is indeed the hope of his fathers. And I want us to note as well, again, just kind of quickly moving through, he goes through his history of how he persecuted the church. He talks about his conversion and how God had intended a particular goal for him and a particular life. And then we see in verse 18, I want to note that he points out his mission, right? To open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Now, I know we don't have Paul's position. We're not inspired apostles, but isn't that our mission goal? Isn't that our mission with the local congregation? If it's not, it should be, because that's exactly the business that we're in. So, therefore, verse 19, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. That brings so much on us, doesn't it? It's like, am I going to be disobedient to this heavenly vision? This of why I'm here? There's so much here for us to look at here, but we don't have the time tonight. I want to just skip over to verse 24, where Festus sort of interrupts him. And this is where you sort of understand why these people are aliens. They're used to speeches that are political, speeches that are all about, look how great we are, and look how good we did with this, and look how good we did with that. They're not someone speaking honestly and genuinely from the heart about the truth. And I think that's why Festus has this outburst. Paul, much reason has made you go mad. Well, he's missing it completely. Paul is just very calmly afterwards, I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but I speak the words of truth and reason. Nobody in that room could have accused Paul of being insane. He is just reasonably putting his case before them. And he pulls this to such a great point here. He says, and I like how Mark's translation said that the New King James says, before whom I speak freely. I'm going to speak boldly to Agrippa. And I think this was a bold thing to say. I'm convinced none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. He's talking about the gospel, the coming of Jesus. All of these events were seen. It was a matter of public record. All the things that happened with the early church up to this time. I wonder if this is really the one of the real high points of the book of Acts, because we're pulling everything we've already seen about the early church and we say this stuff was not hidden. And here's a point that I think we really need to take to heart in our conversations with others, where he says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. He doesn't wait to hear that answer. He pushes him into this sort of corner and sort of demands him to take a stand somewhere. And I think that's why. I really think that it's not so much, oh, you are almost going to make me a Christian. Oh, I'm really thinking about this now. I'm not sure that's it. It may be it, but I really think Agrippa likely was, his back was against the wall. The truth was in front of him. And instead of actually dealing with it, he wants to say, oh, you're going to make me a Christian in such a short order? This is absurd. And then Paul says, hey, I would to God that not only you, but all who hear me today might become both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains. Now, I tell you, isn't that an appeal? I'll tell you, if we have more of that attitude among our friends and our family, then I think maybe we might be more successful in our evangelism. I'm not pointing any finger. I'm pointing every finger at me right now, because we have to be willing to be bold. But we also have to be willing to remind each other and ourselves of the truth. And you see the effect. I wonder how the scene was after Paul left the room. Was there just sort of a shocked silence? And then they just start saying, this man is doing nothing deserving of death or chains. It's the kind of reaction Pontius Pilate had to Jesus. I know this man's done nothing wrong. So Agrippa says again, he might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Our fill in the blank in Acts 26:18, a place among those sanctified by faith in him. 25, he wasn't insane. He was saying what was what? True and reasonable. Paul noted that King Agrippa was this already with our blanks there, but does anybody have any comments or questions? Yes, sir.
In 2 Timothy 2:5, he says, in meekness instructing those who oppose themselves.
Yes.
If that isn't a readout of what all these people are doing, the Jews are opposing themselves, they're after him for what they're all trying to achieve. I mean, it's just astounding. It's so reasonable, and as I read through this, I just have to laugh. These guys, they always appeal to Caesar, and I don't know what to tell them. It's like they're in their own situations because they weren't listening.
Yeah. It's amazing to see this, and I did mention, 1 Corinthians 18 through 23, wisdom of man doesn't work the righteousness of God. It's the sense of that how the world is going to perceive those things. It's just going to be very, very different from how God's followers perceive them. Waldron says this, Waldron says, except for this chain of events, such people as Felix, Festus, Agrippa, and the others present would never have heard the gospel proclaimed. Another commentator says this, what looks like a legal can of worms tainted with the odor of corruption is the unfolding of God's plan. We need to remember that and keep that in mind. Thankful for all the good discussion today. Anybody have anything else before we have our invitation and all that? All right. Appreciate your time.